Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a rapidly changing continent. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I'm co-hosting this season with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having Rosa Balfour with us. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. I'm really pleased that we're going in with this series. It's a fifth one. When we started, we didn't expect it will get so long. We wanted to document the experiences, but now it's getting really exciting. In the last series, we had a broad range of think tank leaders from economic think tanks, and now for the fifth season of our podcast, we turn to foreign policy. And as we all know, today there is hardly a more relevant moment about that. You know, geopolitics is no longer about out there. It actually directly shapes domestic realities, from energy prices to economic stability to even electoral prospects for many of the people. Unlike other think tank communities, foreign policy community is actually a long stay in Europe. It exists for many decades. Even some organizations have been around for a century. So that means that it has been around and is strong. But given that the current environment is far more turbulent, we thought it's really great to hook up with a number of leaders that are leading some of the most preeminent European think tanks in the domain of foreign policy. So back to you, Enrique, to introduce today's guest.
Thank you, Goran. So let me welcome our guest, Dr. Rosa Balfour. Rosa is the director of Carnegie Europe, but prior to joining Carnegie, she worked as a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She's also been director of Europe in the World Program at the European Policy Center in Brussels, and has been a researcher in Rome and London. Rosa is also a regular contributor to major newspapers such as Le Monde, The Guardian, and many others. And I should also say she will be a keynote speaker at the 2026 OTT conference in Rabat in May, and I'm looking forward to that. Welcome, Rosa.
Hello, Enrique. Hello, Goran.
So thank you for joining us. As an opening question, we want to set the scene. So many of the listeners to this podcast will not be from Europe or will be familiar with the context of Europe today. But we don't want to make this too dense of a first question. And so we want to ask you if you could use a film or a movie to describe the European context today or the Brussels context today, and what would that movie or film be?
Thanks, Enrique. So I have to say, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? And I've come up with 3 films in the end. Now, Europe is always a bit of a complex animal, especially if you look at it through the prism of the European Union. So perhaps 3 is needed. Film number 1, Cabaret, which is based on Christopher Isherwood's book, Goodbye to Berlin. So it's about Germany in the 1930s. It's a musical. There's a lot of wonderful music, a lot of costume. There's a lot of life and love. But there's also this sort of looming arrival of Nazism. Now, I say, I thought of this. It was one of the first films that came to my mind. But then I thought after the change of regime in Hungary, it was perhaps a little bit unfair to consider Cabaret as a film that illustrates the political situation of the moment. But then another film, unfortunately, came straight into my head, and it's Brazil, which is a film from the 1980s, a kind of surreal dystopian film about a bureaucracy that doesn't function very well, but it embraces the everyday lives of its characters. So here, too, a little bit dystopian, again, this sense of looming crisis that both films have. But I also thought maybe it's a little bit unfair. So given that the sort of heterogeneity that we have on this continent, I came up with another film, which is a later film by Robert Altman. It's called Shortcuts, and it's done in lots of different episodes. And there's some episodes that are more moving than others, other episodes that are really quite disquieting. But there's some eccentricity, there is some positive feelings, there is love and joy, but there is also this sense of anxiety. And I think that sort of sums it up. I couldn't come up with the single film, but that was my train of thought. on the movie
Rosa,
front.
are you thinking of these films as sort of three separate films, or they're just running at the same time and just watching them?
Well, I did think it's a film with the structure of shortcuts, which is a film in episodes that are interconnected, but with 2 or 3 or maybe 4 stories that were referring very much to the looming disaster, be it, dictatorship, be it, the dictatorship of a bureaucracy, because I don't think that we should be excluded in a later future. Had, say, 4 episodes out of 10, 12 being cabaret and Brazil style, I think that would have captured things nicely.
And if we can move away from the art, the metaphor, and move into the concrete a little bit. This is the Europe of today. How do you think Europe has changed, say, in the last 15 years in relation to the space, the policy space that think tanks inhabit?
Well, I think Europe has been going through nearly 2 decades of crisis. So it starts 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis, and it kind of has all these sort of ripple effects that snowball. Okay, so it starts with an economic crisis, which is very much about the economy, but also about decision making, and it doesn't involve foreign policy think tanks that much, but it depresses Europe's ability to do foreign policy. And of course, in 2010, 2011, the EU equipped itself with a new diplomatic service. There were lots of expectations. And, I was in that group of people that was expecting something different because of the Lisbon Treaty that had come in. And, major foreign policy crisis did start. Arab Spring is 2011, Crimea, 2014. And we could see how the machinery was not responding, but also we could see how the politics was simply not responding. And since then, Europe has been in total crisis mode. And for me, both personally, but I think also as a think tank, 2016 was a watershed moment. Number one, the Brexit vote and departure of the UK. Number two, Trump's election in the United States. At that time, I was working at the German Marshall Fund. So that was, a think tank that was really dedicated to transatlantic relations. That was a major watershed moment, which, as I said, being a Brit, half Italian, working in an American think tank, it was really, I felt it at a very personal level. And I think since then, things have changed a lot. The context in which we work, there's a stronger sense of urgency. There's a stronger sense of responsibility in terms of what we do and why we do it. But it's also been much harder to work in this context. Not so much get access. I get access. Carnegie Europe gets plenty of access. But actually to be influential, to be listened, when you have, a leadership which is huddled together in the hope that it will stay united and not be broken by all these events.
Rosa, you spoke about the differences of then and now. And I would also welcome to elaborate, what did it change for you? I mean, obviously now you work for a different think tank that also has a sort of a one foot in the United States, but also has to fundraise and has to operate in Europe. And in a way, how is different or the same compared, let's say, to the previous organizations that you work? And then my other sub-question will be, you're in Brussels, but you also cover a lot of national capitals. And as we know, there are a lot of sort of similarities, but also differences. Can you elaborate also a bit how things have remained the same or changed as well when we talk about these differences between Brussels and the national capitals?
Yeah, so the funding thing, let's be honest, since I started working in a think tank work has started to be cut, right? So there's much less government support for think tanks. And this is across the board in member states in particular. And when I was going in London and in Rome, the heavy axe of budget cuts was felt. And the think tanks I've worked in Brussels have a slightly different setup, but still, funding is the constant nightmare of anybody working in a think tank. I would say the flip side of funding cuts is that think tanks have to be much clearer about what they want to do, why they want to do it, and just be, much more deliberate in the way in which they position themselves with respect to funders. On the difference between Brussels and national capitals, it's interesting. When I moved to Brussels, I found Brussels and the whole ecosystem around the European Union far more open and accessible. And it was much easier to trace one's impacts, and there's certain processes that were carried out. And I'm talking here, even before I moved to Brussels, there was lots. This was a time in which the European neighbourhood policy was thought through. This was a time of great optimism. So there was EU enlargement, then the neighbourhood policy was thought through. And, I could see from the policy documents that some of the things that I had written, some sentences or some ideas had actually percolated into the policy documents. So it's quite an open system. And I think from 2015, 2016 onwards, I sensed a lot more closure in Brussels because of this sense of being under threat, because the sense that the EU could collapse under the weight of the migration crisis or, various foreign policy crises. And actually the system closed up a little bit more. Conversely, I think in member states, it used to be really quite hard to get to have access. And I think in many respects it still is, but the think tank world really struggled, it had to have all these political connections, right? These party political connections. It was actually much harder to access the actual decision makers. I think now it's become easier. At least it has become a little bit easier for me, but I wonder whether that's also a function of my role, age and experience. And, if you go to a member state capital with a brand like Carnegie, doors will open more easily, perhaps. Whereas I think if you're working in a national think tank in a member state, the government is looking more for positions that are more politically aligned, right? So they're not just interested in expertise. And I think that's a big difference. Yeah.
Natalie, that is really interesting because it mirrors almost exactly what Natalie Tocci said to us before.
All right, okay.
National level work being more political with a capital P, more about building coalitions, networks, trust with political actors, and then Brussels work being more technocratic, more around policy with a smaller P, which again, is interesting what you've said. It means that the more technocratic work is easier to trace, whereas the more political one is less so because there aren't any documents or paper trails you leave behind from those trust building exercises and efforts.
No, I mean, Brussels is the capital of processes, that's for sure, and of policy documents.
Exactly. So there is something to look at. But
if there was ever a strategy per capita, I think probably Brussels will win the competition more even than the Chinese. Sorry, go ahead, Enrique.
No, it just makes me think, and Goran and I were talking about this before as well, but it makes me think about, therefore you need different approaches or different strategies to have impact in these two different contexts. And I guess it also requires different kind of leadership, or maybe a leadership that has to play multiple roles or carry out multiple functions within the organization. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about what leadership in a foreign policy think tank in Europe looks like today. Like, what are the things that you have to worry about? What are the things you have to, dedicate your time and your energy towards as the head of Carnegie?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be a bit of a jack of all trades to lead a think tank, because you need to be recognized as a thought leader. You need to have a solid research background, but you also need to be pretty entrepreneurial in networking, getting to know the right people in the right place so that you can be impactful. B, doing your fundraising, C, raising the profile, and D, but not necessarily in this order, making sure that the people you work with are also able to thrive. So in my case, I have Carnegie Europe has a group of 15, 16 scholars, and then there's a team that is based here in Brussels. And one of the unique things that we have at Carnegie Europe is that our scholars are not just based in Brussels. They kind of, spread across Europe, which, for instance, makes it a lot easier to have access in national capitals, so that our research and our findings can be well disseminated and can be impactful and influential across capitals. And that's, from Madrid all the way to Istanbul, London, to Rome, Berlin, Paris, obviously. We have people in 6 or 7 different European capitals. The flip side of that is that, and just to add, having people in these capitals is not just that we can disseminate, but also we can look at European politics through the prism of what's happening in European countries and not just Brussels, right? Because Brussels really is quite a unique microcosm, and you can't really explain Brussels just from what's happening here. And the other thing, of course, is that we're not just EU-facing, we are pan-European facing. The flip side, of course, is then it falls a bit more on my shoulders to do the representation here in Brussels. And I mean, I could, there are at least 1 or 2 workshops per day here. So there's a lot going on. Obviously, I can't attend everything, but that does require, and that's another category in my job description, that is representing the institution wherever you go. So that would be, I guess, category E. I think I put in A, B, C, D, E. Yeah. Sorry, you had another question, but I've forgotten what it was. You had 2 questions. I forgot the second one.
I was asking you about exactly what you've just described, which is the different skill sets, the different roles you have to play. I guess my other question has to do with whether that, I mean, you've addressed the issue of working in different places, right? At the regional level in Europe, but also at the national level in capital cities. But maybe it's unfair to say, what are the skills you need to work in the 2 places? But I guess maybe I'm jumping ahead on a question that I had, which is then how does the think tank need to be resourced or structured to be effective in both at the regional level, say in Brussels, and at the capital city level in Berlin or in Paris, for example? Does that require 2 different types of communication approaches? Requires, of course, multiple different channels of communication, different agendas. What might be on the agenda in Brussels today might not be on the agenda in Paris, right?
Yeah. Okay. Listen, I mean, there are 2 things. One, yes, one has to tailor what one does to the specific context. You need to be aware of who the audience is. And 2, and I think this is where the sort of Carnegie brand comes in. What we strive to work at, and what is my sort of number 1 goal, is to make sure that the analysis that we carry out is useful to multiple audiences, and it is conveyed in a way that is understandable to multiple audiences. So we don't produce papers with EU acronyms in their title, which is what a lot of EU-based think tanks do, because they take it for granted. They publish in a sort of policy cycle that recognizes what the debate is about. We try to position ourselves outside that cycle. So for me, the presence here, but the presence in member states and the travel abroad beyond Europe is really important, because it helps us understand, why is this problem important? And why is it important, A, for Brussels, be it EU, NATO, etc., B, for member states, C, for the world outside, D, for a wider audience. But what I did want to say, Enrique, because I've made a little note here, I've got a little post-it here, and I think it was in response to the question, how does, what you do, all the foreign policy stuff, how does it have an immediate effect on European economies, etc.?
Yeah, what is your answer? Yeah, now I'm very curious.
Yeah, so no, you had, what does it mean to lead? The question is, I'm reading here, what does it mean to lead a foreign policy think tank at a time of geopolitical shocks, Middle East, etc., that have immediate effects on European economies, politics, and public opinion, right? And here I think, okay, is that okay if we move on to this?
Yeah, please.
No, I mean, here there are a number of things here that I'd like to say. The first is, with the world being in so much turmoil, we have a full-time job simply providing full-time, 24/7 commentary on what is happening, which is, I think, the kind of death of a think tank, because it means that you're not able to do the in-depth research because you run out of time, right? We could be on the media roll all the time. And in order to provide some added value by comparison to what reporting is doing, we also need to have the depth. We need to have the expertise. This is expertise that you cultivate over years. It's people with PhDs, it's people within the field experience, it's people who have a whole web of contacts in the various global regions who know their stuff, and they need to have the time to keep up that knowledge, and they need to have the time to be able to offer an interpretation that is not just, what the media is offering. It's not just the standard line. And, at this time of sort of globalization of information, we see that a lot of stories are being told through the lens of one, someone who successfully managed to frame the debate and everybody's following. And, as a think tank, we need to do something different. The second challenge, I think, for a Europe-based think tank that looks at that asks itself, what is Europe's global role, be it through the EU or other formats? On a lot of these geopolitical issues, the EU and Europe is pretty silent. Or if it has things to say, it has not much to offer. And that's a real challenge because, it becomes a little bit repetitive to say the EU should do more here, the EU should raise its voice there, the EU could do X, Y, and Z, when actually this is simply not going to happen. So how can you think creatively about, first of all, there's a bit of a problem, if you work on, European politics and Europe's global role, to admit that Europe doesn't have one, it's like admitting, well, our job is not necessary, right? So you need to find an appropriate balance between a critique of Europe's role in crisis X, Y, and Z, and identifying areas where Europeans can actually contribute to global politics and explain them in terms that are understandable to people outside Europe. And, one of the things I often say is that depending on where I go, I use, I am more or less critical of Europe. When I'm speaking of the European Union in Brussels, I'm a lot more critical than when I am speaking about it in London, for instance, especially after Brexit, or even in the United States. But you still need to frame things in ways that can be compelling for people who are not interested in the ins and outs. And then the third point that I think is really important and has become more important for think tanks because of all these crises is that actually we do have a responsibility to contribute to the public debate. This is not just for the glory of being, on primetime television. It really is about helping ordinary citizens understand what is happening. And one thing that I have recently started to do to pay more attention to is media requests coming from small countries, for instance, in the European Union, including in languages that, including in languages that are not spoken beyond that country in question. And, for think tankers are always seeking the limelight in the big news and the big magazines, especially the American ones, foreign affairs, foreign policy. And that's obviously it's personally satisfying to be quoted or to write in one of these magazines. But if your focus is Europe, and if you want Europeans to better understand the sort of global developments and how they impact the European predicament, you need to reach out to people in smaller countries as well. And it's not glamorous. It's a lot of hard work because, there are lots of small countries out there. But actually, I think it's part of the responsibility as think tankers to accept, media contributions that are not going to do much for personal vanity, but might do a bit in helping further the debate.
That's an interesting, Rosa. Let me ask you a follow-up question on this, because it's a question that comes up a lot with other think tank leaders, right? So I guess there's there's a principled reason to be commenting, right? To be participating in the running commentary of affairs, because you want to say, you want to inform the public debate, right? You want to help frame the public debate. You want to make sure that maybe groups of populations that are not participating actively get a chance to do that. There's also a utilitarian reason, which is you can gain visibility, right? Which might help you with influence later on, and it'll certainly help you with funding or with gaining your visibility. But while you're doing all of that, you're not necessarily doing the deeper, nuanced sort of research that needs to be done every once in a while, at the very least, so that your commentary can be more than just that, right? More than just running commentary. How do you decide? How does the leader of a think tank decide where to put its organization's resources? I don't suggest on a day-to-day basis, but I guess on average, right?
Yeah. I mean, one is, spread the burden and the glory. You get media requests, pass them. I get a lot simply because of my position, pass them on to other scholars. And, by the way, doing media can also be a nice learning ground for younger scholars who might practice. Focus on what you know, avoid comment. I'm sorry, far too many think tankers comment on things they're not really that competent on. So avoid doing that, avoid getting onto that train, always stick to what you know. I mean, there are some additional considerations. For instance, it's not just clicks, how many people are going to read me, hear me, see me. It's also what kind of networks if I speak to someone from this kind of newspaper, am I reaching the right kind of networks that I want to reach? Or is it just for the glory of it? So there are a number of considerations. And then, honestly, there are only so many hours in a day. Often requests come last minute. And if you can do it, you do it. But if you can't, you just say no. And I say no a lot. But, and we could be out there a little bit more in the media. But Carnegie Europe is so focused on quality that actually the media bit is a little bit less important than our writing and our researching. So it's not our top goal, that's for sure.
That's also probably logical in the times when there's so much punditry and there's so many people like fighting for that attention. But then when you see, okay, what's the substance coming from that fight, there is very little. As you mentioned, there's a next crisis and now suddenly everybody's an expert. As we saw probably after the Hungarian elections, suddenly many more Hungarian experts out there. But speaking of Hungary, at the beginning you said like, okay, there's more upbeat and the results. You're one of the few people who actually has written extensively on the impact of the European radical right on foreign policy. In your analysis, you mentioned the various crises and whatnot, but it's like the sort of internal structural thing. And then with Donald Trump again in the White House, now it just intensifies the dynamics. We have both internal, external. Also in Brussels, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, MCC, has made its name as one of the illiberal or radical right think tanks. And I really cannot pass this opportunity to ask you, since you've been writing and following this extensively, how do you assess the influence also of these organizations on foreign policy and the broader think tank / policy ecosystem in Europe?
Yeah. No, thanks for this question. And it's also interesting because I've just come back from the United States. And it's kind of made me think a little bit, comparing the situation in the US to the situation in Europe. So you mentioned MCC, which has been endowed very, very well by the previous, still current Hungarian government on the way out, Hungarian government. And they have a large center here and they're very, very active. And they attract a lot of people. A lot of people go to their events, but their events are so explicitly partisan that the people who go there actually are people from, people working in the parliament for the three groups that include radical right parties in the European Parliament. It's very much, that is the ecosystem in which they're operating. So even though MCC and Hungary has been, and there's also in Poland there are think tanks, they're popping up all over all over Europe, actually, because radical right parties have understood that they need to have think tanks if they want to build their own governing infrastructure. But I have to say that by comparison to the United States, these think tanks are still operating a bit among themselves. They're not, if I go to a big event on foreign and security policy, or even a small event on foreign and security policy, which brings together the real decision makers, I won't see them sitting at the table. So they haven't made that impact. Politically, the radical right has made has been very influential in shaping foreign policy. And, I've written a lot about that. So if you're interested, go and read those papers. But then if I look at the United States, what's interesting, and again, so my privileged events are these smaller, closed door things with a mix of think tankers and decision makers, right? So I was just at one of these in Washington, and there was a pretty broad spectrum of opinion at that table, with a far stronger presence of think tanks that are close to the Trump administration and expressing different views, but still close to the Trump administration. And it struck me, number one, that the sort of, this community of experts that in some cases goes in and out of government or in and out of important positions in the US and in Europe. In Europe, at the end of the day, if you look at this community of experts among the foreign and security policy community of experts, there's a lot of agreement. There's a lot of same old. And, that's a positive thing and it's a negative thing. And I'd like to go back to this. But in the United States, there's a lot of different opinions, a lot of diversity. And these think tanks on the right, they're part of the mainstream conversation. Now, it's partly because Donald Trump is there. It's partly because it's the second time round, right? So they've had 10 years. But it's also because, just like Orban, the right in the United States has made big investments on the think tank community. So I think, to me, this signals, first of all, that think tanks are important, okay? Because sometimes they get dismissed, especially in Europe, as, the sort of liberal entities where people discuss about nothing and blah, 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 blah. And at the end of the day, we all have small budgets. We're mostly run on a shoestring. So it's not as if we're a big cost to anyone. So you might as well have the chattering classes, right? That's how many of them. Whereas actually, the think tank infrastructure is actually important, not just because of the role it plays in the sort of beltway of ideas that get to decisions, that get to decision making, but also because they're part of the sort of the one of the pillars of governing systems, right? And if, like in the United States and like in Hungary's Orban, you want to pursue regime change, you need to invest on think tanks. And that's something that Viktor Orban had understood. And that's something that radical right parties across Europe are doing more and more. But I think the limit to the experiments in Europe has been that they haven't produced enough quality and they haven't engaged enough with the sort of, shall we call it, mainstream foreign policy community to be impactful. So you have this paradox in which actually, it's the politicians, the radical right politicians have been very influential on European foreign policy. The think tanks a little bit less, but that's for now. I would watch that space, and I will also make the, claim that, Viktor Orban has been defeated, but he has plenty of places to fall back on to rebuild his role. And he has plenty of friends in Hungary, in Europe, and globally to do that. And we should really watch that space.
But Rosa, I absolutely agree with you. And also, we have to actually look at a bit of a longer time frame, because if you look at the US think tanks, you can also say they were not influential exactly in the first 5 or 10 years of their existence. I mean, there was, I remember decades ago, we were all talking about the Koch brothers and investing into what turned out to be radical right at the time was the Republican Party and the ecosystem and all. So I think we need to have a longer sort of time span to see whether this will percolate in the way it will. But what's happening then on the more progressive side? Let's call it a liberal, although I try not to use that label. But what's happening on the progressive side? Because, you mentioned, and we know, I mean, Enrique and I follow think tanks. We know, a lot of excellent think tanks really work on a shoestring budget. I mean, I don't even want to put how much the annual budgets of all other foreign policy think tanks probably will pale in comparison only with the MCC's budget. And what's happening that? Is it why there is no funding if we say that actually the problems are more acute or the crises are more acute? How do you explain that?
But it pales in comparison with not just the MCC, probably all the foreign policy think tanks in Europe pale in comparison with the budget of Brookings, right? Or the budget of the Urban Institute. And I know things are more expensive in the US, but I think what you're saying, Rosa, is interesting, right? There is an investment rationale or investment theory that applies in the US that doesn't apply in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, in Europe, there are political foundations. I think they're not particularly well funded either, but there's a lot of spreading around the funding towards lots of different think tanks. So it's quite a fragmented landscape, ultimately. That's one problem. The second problem is that, and I mentioned at the beginning, since the beginning of my career, we've been dealing with budget cuts, right? And lots of those budget cuts came from governments. Governments used to support think tanks and, they'd spend X amount of money. It was the distribution of that budget wasn't necessarily merit-based. It was, following often political logics in each country, distributing, this think tank is close to this political party, gets X, and this other one, maybe it was a reflection of the size of the political party in parliament, and they'd get, certainly, for instance, in Germany, that is a factor. So the way in which the sort of think tank ecosystem is funded is quite politicized. And I guess that's probably, for people like Orban, they watch it from outside because and they think, well, I want to do the same. And therefore, that's a little bit the logic. So it's not a merit-based logic. Secondly, the United States benefits massively simply from scale. There are loads of think tanks in the US as well, but they have single language and not 24, 25 languages that we have in just in the European Union. And still, I think the scale question helps them. Third, there is in the US, there is different culture of philanthropy, so think tanks can have funding from different sources. And in Europe, Carnegie Europe has different sources of funding, and I think that's the key ingredient for success. I mean, if you depend on one source and that source closes up, you have to close shop, right? So that's really important, but it's very hard to get. It's very hard to cultivate that diversity of funding. It takes up a lot of work. And then, fourth, that when I'm saying same old, I mean, especially for the think tanks working on Europe, it's really hard to sort of emerge from sort of basically European think tanks working on foreign policy. And I'm part of the generation of people who became educated, right, did their masters and PhDs and became interested in Europe at a time of optimism about Europe, right? And where, there were all sorts of research projects and academic articles about Europe's role as a civilian power, as a normative power. I think many of us thought that Europe could be a force for good, right? And then, this idea sort of came crashing against multiple realities. And so how can think tank leaders like myself and all my peers who came out of this come up with a different narrative that is A, compelling, B, reflects the political realities of Europe, C, can offer some, advice or policy suggestion that actually is workable? It's really difficult. So there's a lot of the same old as Europe should do more. And that's a little bit the sort of the subtitle of most think tank papers these days, with the struggle to actually say something that can be captured, understood, implemented, is realistic, but has vision. It's a really difficult
balance. I think that's the key word of not just the series, but the entire podcast. We've touched upon Carnegie Europe in various ways. So let me go ahead and ask you a little bit more about Carnegie Europe as a think tank. And we had prepared a question similar to the movie, but this time looking at a song and asking you if there is a song that would best describe Carnegie Europe.
Okay, so here too, I have to say, first of all, the president of Carnegie Endowment also has the tendency to spring on you questions of this kind.
Okay,
when he
so
did when he did that first time, I was like, oh, and I said, oh, well, it would be Mozart, an orchestra, not a symphony, not a solo, but an orchestra. Then I thought about it a bit more and I thought, yeah, but Mozart is just so perfect. And I think Carnegie Europe is a bit more dissonant, right? We're not all here, first of all. And so I thought of Bela Bartok. But then I thought, come on, Rosa, that sounds really pretentious. I do think Bela Bartok is actually, again, an orchestra. There's a wonderful piece for orchestra and percussions it would be perfect. But then eventually I came to a song that everybody knows. David Bowie, We Can Be Heroes. And it's not because of the heroes, but it's because when he wrote it, he was in West Berlin, looking over onto East Berlin. He was through a musical phase in which he was trying to experiment. And he kind of felt he was sort of on the border between tradition and new things. And of course, it's, Berlin, East Berlin, West Berlin, and, Carnegie Europe likes to think of itself as a sort of pan-European think tank to capture that kind of division. And then finally, We Can Be Heroes, he wrote it in the 70s, but it actually became famous after 1989, the song, right? It wasn't one of his biggest successes. And in a way, again, I think it reflects Carnegie Europe in the sense that we really tried hard to think ahead and what is going to be important in the future, not just what is important in the present debate. And, it's a difficult exercise, what is going to stay, how to cut through the noise, but it's something we spend time doing. And in a way, I think We Can Be Heroes reflected that.
Well, excellent. It rings in my brain. And frankly, Bartok, with the weaving in a lot of Hungarian folklore into the composition, one could argue as well a more populist version of a class that is a more populist or popular version of classical music. Excellent suggestions, Rosa. In these conversations, we also like to look at the sort of the personal side of the leaders. And you've been a leader in think tanks for a long time. You already labeled this function of a director of a think tank, of a jack of all trades, and you explain. So perhaps we can actually ask you a bit more about the strategic decisions. Like if you can share, what were the sort of the key strategic decisions, be that there were headaches or be that they were really something that you're proud even to this very moment and they made an impact over time that you had to make in the past.
Yeah, I mean, honestly speaking, Carnegie Endowment is a solid organization. So I've never had difficult decisions to make in the sense that, I've never had to lay people off, I mean, there are a few, I guess, when I came in, there were a few things that I decided to discontinue and there are new things that I decided needed to pursue, but I wouldn't consider them necessarily difficult. I think the key point really is, and, I never stop saying this, we are, Carnegie Endowment has been going on since 1910. And the reason for which it continues to this day is because of its focus on excellence, on quality. So for me, that is the thing that needs to be done every day. And that is we have to do it through quality of our work, through having the right peer reviewing processes, and everybody has to be involved in that. This is not just about the scholar, it's about the whole machinery and how it functions. And that is the sort of overarching goal. When I joined, it was in the middle of COVID. And, I had plans. It was in the middle of COVID. It was at the beginning of COVID, actually. 2 weeks into lockdown, and I started this job. I had plans. My plan was to get to know the team. It was in sort of concentric circles, get to know the team, get to know the scholars, fly out to Washington for the big retreat with everybody, get to know everybody there. I couldn't do any of that. I didn't meet my global colleagues until 2022. So I only met my, European ones, whenever whenever it was possible. So, with my sort of big strategic decisions, in the bin, I just took a deep dive. And I think it paid off in the end, and I did it a little bit with a bit of a responsibility, in the sense I didn't feel there was anything else I could do. So just go for it. So it was a little bit on the impetuous side, shall we say, or at least, by comparison to my character, which perhaps is a bit more thoughtful. And that paid off, I think. And I think in that COVID year, and I remember when I came out of COVID year, started meeting people, and they said, "Oh, you're everywhere. I see you everywhere." And I thought, okay, it's probably paid off. We did, let's go virtual. Let's make sure these debates are kept alive. And that's something that worked. And then, it paid off. When Tony Blinken came to Europe for the first time since COVID, I moderated his meeting with Stoltenberg, head of Tony Blinken as US Secretary of State, Stoltenberg as Secretary General of NATO. So it paid off. We had our moments of glory.
Interesting. I think COVID offered lots of opportunities for people to take risks, and those who took them, in many ways, I think, got ahead of others in the field, right? Because the world changed quite a lot in that period. Let me ask you another question along those lines, but this is a bit more personal, just asking you about the personal aspect of leading a think tank or working in a think tank. And especially, I guess, in the context in which we are, with this looming threat or looming crises, what's the personal effect of being at the head of Carnegie Europe, or the head of a foreign policy think tank in this current context?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking earlier about responsibility, and when I started in this line of work, it wasn't because I felt a sense of responsibility or mission. It was because it was intellectually stimulating. It responded to my personal interests, and what I was really interested in is doing something that was interesting, so I would get something out of it. And then all of a sudden, you realize that actually you've got responsibility, and on the one hand, it gives more sense to my line of work. And I guess it supports projecting myself out as in a leadership role. So I have responsibility towards the people who work with me, towards my peers, towards the people above me, etc. And of course, beyond that. And, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gives you purpose. On the other hand, it's a bit of a heavy burden as well. And sometimes in leadership positions, one can feel a bit lonely. At the end of the day, it's my responsibility, which also means it's my fault if things go wrong. So it's, so the downside is that it's very hard to take a break from the news cycle. It's very hard to not reach for your phone first thing in the morning. Yeah, that's quite hard. So, yeah.
And Rosa, any advice? Because we know that people who either are in the think tanks or they're aspiring to work in think tanks are listening to this podcast. Is there any advice that you would like to give to the current or the next generations of think tank leaders?
That's a good point. I think I said that earlier. I wasn't very deliberate in my career, in the sense I didn't say, oh, I want to become director of Carnegie Europe, or, I want to move up, or, So it kind of happened to me. And so I think some steps I didn't take, in terms of I wasn't always strategic or tactical. But one thing I always have been, and it's the thing that I wish others were as well, because I get good feedback and it's actually very rewarding. I've been supportive of my network, and I've been supportive of my team, right? So dedicate time to mentoring people when you see that they have qualities, because they will be the next generation of leaders. And it is very rewarding. I mean, when people ask me, what are you most proud of? And I said, oh, well, there's that person who works in that think tank over there, or in that university over there, and he or she was an intern with me, and I liked him or her and did my bit, and that person recognizes it. And that's honestly the best thing. And I believed in teamwork always, and working with people you can work with. And I do think that networks, and by networks, friends really, who people you can hold hands with when there's something to fight for. I've, by natural inclination, have always cultivated them, and I have found that, this position was told, I was suggested, I was, invited to apply by friends, right? And that's really important. So for me, cultivating that has been important, even if, sometimes when you're too horizontally focused, you're not climbing up the ladder. So there can be downsides to that. A lot of people are focusing on the hierarchy and how to get up there. I've been a bit more focusing on my network, the sort of horizontal nature of it, but I don't regret it, and it's very rewarding.
Thank you very much, Rosa. I mean, yeah, you're right. It's not just, it's not enough. It's not, you just can't complain that it's a lonely job or lonely role, because you can build those networks and those relationships around you in many ways. And let me ask you a final question, and this refers to the future of the sector itself, the future of think tanks. What do you think the future holds for think tanks?
I think European countries have embarked on a phase in which they'll be spending a lot on defense, in which security is going to be at the forefront of any conversations. And so think tanks will be facing a very difficult, a very competitive landscape in order to survive. I think some will go down, some might merge, and others will do well. It is a time, and this is something I'm working on, thinking about where will we be in 2 years' time, and not just next year, because there's going to be a long wave of impact. If you look back at the financial crisis, but 2007, 2008, but actually the impact on think tanks came in a few years later, and I think that's going to happen here too. We're going to see, private sector cuts. Foundations are going to be trying to fill the gaps because of private sector cuts. And obviously, national budgets are going to be cut as well. So it's going to be a difficult and competitive landscape. And I doubt very much that all the think tanks that exist today will be there in 10 years' time.
With that note, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It was fun.
You can listen to this and other podcasts in the series whenever you listen to your podcast, or by visiting on thinktanks.org. And from Goran and me, goodbye.